The groan of the overloaded auger was a sound Arthur Madsen knew better than his own heartbeat. It was the autumn of '73, and the corn was coming in heavy and dry, a blessing that felt more like a curse down at the co-op elevator. The line of trucks and wagons stretched half a mile down the gravel road, shimmering in the dusty gold of a late October afternoon. Art's 1966 International Lodestar 1600, its red paint faded to a dull brick color, idled patiently, the straight-six gas engine popping and rumbling with a rhythm he could diagnose from 100 yards away. In the grain box behind him sat 250 bushels of golden No. 2 corn, the fruits of a 12-hour day spent wrestling with a machine most men had sent to the scrapyard a decade ago. Ahead of him, the line shuddered to a halt. The reason was Dale Bishop. Dale wasn't just unloading, he was putting on a show. His truck was a brand-new Chevy C60, gleaming white and chrome, powered by a big 427 V8 that rumbled with a deep, arrogant confidence. But it was the machine that had harvested the corn that was the real spectacle. Parked near the scales, where everyone had to see it, was Dale's new John Deere 7700 Turbo Combine. It was a monster, a rolling factory of green and yellow steel that dwarfed everything around it. The cab was air-conditioned, the paint was still glossy, and the 6-row corn head looked wide enough to swallow Art's entire farm in one pass. Dale, lean and tanned with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, hopped down from his truck and swaggered over to Art's open window. He leaned against the door, hooking his thumbs in his brand-new Wrangler jeans. "Still wrestling with that old museum piece, Art," he said, loud enough for the next 3 drivers to hear. He nodded toward the cloud of dust a mile away, where Art's rig was still working. "I swear I can hear that old pull type gasping for air from here." Art kept his eyes on the truck ahead. He didn't give Dale the satisfaction. His machine was an International Harvester 123, a self-propelled combine's poorer pull-type cousin. It was powered by the PTO of his trusty Farmall 806 diesel, a tractor he'd rebuilt from the crankshaft out. It was slow, it was noisy, and on a hot day, the dust and chaff would stick to your sweat until you looked like a scarecrow come to life. But it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every grease zerk was paid for. "She gets the job done, Dale," Art said, his voice low and even. "Gets it done." Dale laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Art, I finished my corn yesterday. 280 acres in 4 days. At the rate you're going, you'll be out there picking by hand come Thanksgiving. You know, the bank's practically giving money away. A man can't afford to run old junk anymore. You got to get big or get out." Art finally turned his head, his blue eyes, weathered from years of squinting into the sun, locking onto Dale's. "The bank doesn't give anything away, Dale. They rent it, and the rent always comes due." Dale's smile tightened. He clapped a hand on Art's truck door, a gesture that was meant to be friendly, but felt like a claim. "You're a stubborn fool, Madsen. Your daddy was the same way. Thought a dollar in the pocket was worth more than 100 acres on a note. This is a new age. You got to use their money to make your own. It's called leverage." He pushed himself off the door and sauntered back to his truck as the line began to move. Art watched him go, then eased his foot off the clutch, the old Lodestar lurching forward. He could feel the eyes of the other farmers on him. They saw his faded truck, knew about his ancient combine. They saw Dale's new iron, heard his talk of expansion and big government checks. They saw the future in Dale Bishop, and in Arthur Madsen they saw a ghost from the past, a man farming on borrowed time. The thing was, Art knew his machines. He knew the specific whine the 806's hydraulic pump made when the fluid was a quart low. He knew the exact number of turns on the cylinder speed crank of the 123 combine to get the perfect thresh on 18% moisture corn. He knew the smell of the grease he used on the U-joints was different from the smell of the grease for the wheel bearings. His grandfather had bought the farm with cash after the Great Depression, and his father had burned the mortgage in the kitchen stove in 1958. The one lesson hammered into him from boyhood was simple: never let a banker sit at your dinner table. Debt was a chain, and Art Madsen was determined to be a free man. Dale's philosophy was the polar opposite. He'd inherited a good quarter section and immediately mortgaged it to buy the farm next door. Then he'd used that new, larger acreage as collateral for a massive operating loan to buy the biggest and best equipment money could buy. He farmed fence row to fence row, chasing government subsidies and ever bigger yields. He called it progress. Art called it a gamble with a stacked deck. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever known a man like Art? The kind who'd rather spend a week grinding valves and setting the timing on an old engine than sign his name on a banknote? Or maybe you knew a Dale, a man who believed that new paint and a full line of credit were the only true measures of a farmer. Let me know in the comments which one you'd have trusted to bring in your crop when the storm clouds started gathering on the horizon. Art finished at the elevator and rumbled back down the county road. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and purple. The dust from his combine hung in the still air over the back 40, a golden haze marking his slow but steady progress. He pulled the truck into the field, ready to unload into the wagon so he could keep the combine moving. But as he got closer, he noticed the dust had settled. The familiar chugging of the farmall and the rhythmic threshing of the 123 were gone. There was only silence, broken by the chirping of crickets. He found the rig stopped in the middle of a pass. The lights of the 806 were on, cutting a lonely swath through the twilight. Art knew before he even got out of the truck. It was the kind of deep, mechanical silence that meant something vital had broken. He walked over, his boots crunching on the dry corn stalks. The air smelled of hot metal and burnt hydraulic fluid. A dark puddle was spreading on the ground beneath the combine, soaking into the rich black Iowa soil. He climbed up the ladder and shined his flashlight into the guts of the machine. It was worse than he thought. The main hydraulic pump, the very heart that powered the reel, the unloading auger, and the variable speed drive had catastrophically failed. A hairline crack he'd been monitoring for a week had finally let go, vomiting the machine's lifeblood onto the field. The pump housing was shattered. It wasn't something you could weld or patch. It was done, and with 20 acres of his best corn still in the field and a forecast calling for heavy rain in 36 hours, he was done too. The next morning broke cold and grey, the sky the colour of a lead weight. Art was in his workshop before the sun was even a rumour. The shop wasn't much, just a converted corn crib with a concrete floor he'd poured himself. But it was his sanctuary. It smelled of motor oil, welding rods, and damp earth. Along one wall were shelves sagging with coffee cans full of bolts, nuts, and washers, all sorted by size and thread. A heavy-duty chain hoist hung from a massive oak beam overhead. He had worked half the night under floodlights, wrestling the dead hydraulic pump out of the combine's belly. It now sat on his workbench, a greasy 150-pound lump of cast iron. It was a Vickers vane pump, a good design, but this one was 40 years old. Finding a replacement wouldn't be easy. The local Case IH dealer just laughed when he called. The parts man, a kid barely out of high school, said he'd have to check the microfiche, which was code for "don't hold your breath, old-timer." He spent the morning on the party line telephone, the receiver slick with grease from his hands. He called every implement dealer and salvage yard within 100 miles. It was the same story everywhere. A pump for a 123. Geez, I don't know, Art. We might have crushed one of those out back 5 years ago. By noon, his only lead was a salvage yard over in Webster County, a place called Olson's Boneyard. Old man Olson, his voice crackling over the line, thought he might have a 123 sitting out in the back pasture, but he wasn't sure. Been out there a while, he'd rasped. Probably sunk to the axles. You'd have to come pull it yourself. Art hung up the phone, the silence of the shop pressing in on him. He could feel the clock ticking. The wind was picking up, rattling the tin on the roof. It smelled like rain. Every hour he spent chasing parts was an hour his corn was at the mercy of the weather. He was wiping his hands on a rag when he heard a vehicle pull into his lane. It was Dale Bishop's new Chevy pickup. Dale got out, looking rested and clean in a fresh plaid shirt. He walked into the shop without waiting for an invitation, his eyes immediately landing on the broken pump on the workbench. "Heard you had some trouble," Dale said, a feigned note of sympathy in his voice. He kicked at one of the tires on Art's 806. "These old girls, they just don't have the stamina anymore, do they?" Art didn't say anything. He just kept wiping the grease from his hands, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the fight with the rusted bolts. "Look," Dale continued, getting to his point. "I'm done. Everything's in the bin. I feel for you, Art, I really do. Tell you what I'll do. I'll bring the 7700 over and knock out that last 20 for you, save you the headache." Art stopped wiping his hands. He looked at Dale. "What's the price?" Dale shrugged, trying to look casual. "Well, my custom rate is $25 an acre, plus a little something for moving the machine on a Sunday. Let's call it an even $600. I'll have it done before supper." $600. It was more than Art's net profit on that entire section of the field. It was a predatory offer, and they both knew it. Dale was banking on his desperation. Art could feel the anger rising in his chest, hot and metallic. To pay another man to harvest his own crop, to admit defeat, to let Dale Bishop and his shiny green machine roll onto his land. It was unthinkable. He picked up the rag and slowly, deliberately began wiping his hands again. "I appreciate the offer, Dale, but I'll handle it." Dale's face hardened. The mask of neighborly concern dropped away. "Suit yourself," he snapped. "Don't come crying to me when your corn is flat on the ground tomorrow morning, rotting in the mud. Some people just never learn." He turned and stalked out of the shop. A minute later, the sound of his powerful V8 engine faded down the lane. Art stood alone in the silence, the smell of Dale's exhaust hanging in the air. He looked at his broken hands, then at the dead pump on the bench. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. Maybe Dale was right. Maybe he was just a stubborn fool. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. He wouldn't quit. He grabbed his keys, a thermos of black coffee, and a heavy-duty come-along from the wall. The trip to Olson's boneyard was a 2-hour drive, and he didn't have a minute to waste. The years that followed were a strange time in the heartland. The mid-1970s brought a wave of prosperity nobody had seen coming. Russia bought millions of tons of American grain, and the prices shot into the stratosphere. Corn that was $1 a bushel one year was suddenly $3 the next. Land values doubled, then doubled again. A kind of fever swept through the farming community. The talk at the sale barn and the co-op wasn't about the weather anymore. It was about interest rates, cash flow, and expansion. The bankers, once the most conservative men in town, were now the biggest cheerleaders, handing out loans like free samples at the county fair. Dale Bishop rode that wave like he was born to it. He was the poster child for the new era of agriculture. The $600 he'd tried to charge Art was pocket change to him now. He used the windfall profits from 73 and 74 as down payments on more land. He bought the Hemlock place, then the old Miller farm, when the widow moved to town. In 3 years, he went from farming 400 acres to farming over 1,000. With every new parcel of land came a new piece of equipment. His John Deere 7700 was traded for a brand new 7720 with a bigger engine and grain tank. The 4630 tractor was replaced by a massive 4840. The crowning jewel of his fleet appeared in the fall of '76. A brand new 4-wheel drive Steiger Panther, an articulated green monster that could pull a 12-bottom plow and made the ground tremble when it passed. His farmstead, once modest, now sported 2 giant blue Harvestor silos and a new Morton machine shed that was bigger than the town's basketball gym. Dale was no longer just a farmer, he was an agribusinessman. He was featured in the State Farm Journal, a picture of him smiling in the cab of his Steiger, the headline reading, "Dale Bishop, Farming for the Future." Through all of this, Arthur Madsen kept his head down. He had managed to find that hydraulic pump at Olson's boneyard. It had been buried in mud up to its intake ports, and it took him 4 hours with a spade and the come-along chain to his truck's bumper to wrench it free. He'd hauled it home, spent an entire day disassembling it, cleaning out 30 years of sludge, replacing every seal and gasket, and finally, miraculously, brought his old combine back to life. He got his corn out of the field just as the sky opened up. It was a small victory, but it was his. He didn't get rich during the boom years, not like Dale. But he was comfortable. For the first time in his life, he was completely and totally debt-free. He used the extra money from the high grain prices to pay off the last of the farm's mortgage, a small note his father had taken out for an emergency in the late 50s. On a quiet Tuesday morning, he drove into town, handed a check to Mr. Abernathy at the bank, and walked out with the deed in his hand. There was no celebration, no grand announcement. He just drove home, put the paper in the old metal lockbox where his father had kept it, and went out to grease the hay baler. The community saw it differently. They saw Dale Bishop building an empire, and they saw Art Madsen standing still. They saw Dale's new trucks and Art's faded Lodestar. They saw Dale breaking ground on a new ranch-style house and Art putting a new coat of red paint on his 40-year-old barn. They mistook caution for fear and discipline for a lack of ambition. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, even paid him a personal visit one afternoon. He parked his shiny Buick sedan in the lane and walked out to the workshop where Art was in the middle of an engine overhaul on the 806. The block was split. The head and oil pan were off, and the pistons and sleeves were laid out in precise order on a clean piece of cardboard. "Afternoon, Art," Abernathy said, trying not to get his polished city shoes dusty. "Just thought I'd stop by. See how you're getting on." "Getting on, Bill," Art said, not looking up from wiping down a cylinder sleeve. "Art, we need to talk," the banker said, his tone shifting to business. "The farm's paid off, you've got zero debt, and the value of this land has gone through the roof. You're sitting on a gold mine. You have a tremendous amount of equity just lying dormant." "It's not lying dormant, Bill, it's growing corn." Abernathy sighed. "That's not what I mean. You could leverage that equity. We could write you a loan to buy out the Schmidt quarter section that just came up for sale. We could get you into a new combine, a real one, not that relic." He gestured vaguely toward the old 123 parked in the shed. "You could double your operation, Art, triple it. Dale Bishop is running circles around everyone because he's not afraid to use the bank's money." Art finally stopped his work. He picked up a piston, feeling the solid weight of it in his palm. He looked at the banker, his gaze steady. "Bill, how much does Dale owe you?" Abernathy flinched, his professional smile faltering. "Well, that's confidential information, Art." "I bet it's a number with a lot of zeros at the end of it," Art said quietly. "I appreciate you stopping by, Bill, but I like sleeping at night. I'm not interested in renting any of your money today." The banker left in a huff, and the story was all over the diner by the next morning. Art Madsen had turned down a fortune. He was a fool, a relic, a man who didn't understand modern farming. He was content to be a small-timer while men like Dale Bishop were building the future. The fall of 1977 arrived, and with it the first whispers of trouble. The price of fuel oil nearly doubled. The fertilizer bill was 30% higher than the year before. And interest rates, which had been a stable 7 or 8% for years, began to creep up. 9%, 10, 11. On the radio, newscasters from Des Moines and Chicago started using a new word: inflation. Dale Bishop just laughed it off. "Costs are up, so what?" he'd bellow at the co-op. "I'll just plant more acres. Volume, boys. Volume is the key. You got to outrun the costs." He bought another bigger planter and a new, wider field cultivator to go with his Steiger. His payments to the bank were astronomical, but as long as grain prices stayed high and the land kept appreciating, his books looked good on paper. Art watched and listened. He paid cash for his fuel, filling the 2 big 500-gallon tanks behind his shop. He bought his seed and fertilizer early before the next price hike. He spent the early winter days not in some dealer's office signing papers, but in his shop, methodically tearing down and rebuilding. He replaced the main bearings on the 806. He put new sickles on his haybine. He hard-faced the sweeps on his cultivator, building them up with a bead of tough welding rod so they would last another season. He was battening down the hatches, preparing for a storm he couldn't see but could feel in his bones. That November was colder than anyone could remember. The sky was a constant brooding grey. The first snows came before Thanksgiving, dusting the frozen ploughed fields in a thin layer of white. One evening, as a bitter north wind howled around the corners of the old farmhouse, Art stood on his back porch, a cup of hot coffee warming his hands. He watched the snow beginning to fall again, not in gentle flakes, but in a hard, driving sleet that pinged against the tin roof of the porch. In the distance, across the section, he could see a set of bright lights moving slowly across the horizon. It was Dale's Steiger, its powerful halogen lamps cutting through the gloom. He was still out there, pushing it, trying to get the last of his full chisel ploughing done, racing against a clock that was about to run out on everyone. Art took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitter warmth spreading through his chest. He didn't know it yet, but the blizzard that would define their lives, the blizzard of 78, was already gathering its strength far to the north. A sleeping white monster, getting ready to wake up and devour the world. The snow that began as a stinging sleet turned into a thick, silent curtain by midnight. Art woke in the pre-dawn hours, not to the alarm clock, but to the profound, unsettling quiet that only a world buried in white can produce. The wind had died, leaving behind a landscape transformed, sculpted into alien shapes of pure white. The drift against the north side of the barn was easily 15 feet high, curving up and over the eaves. His lane, the county road, the entire world was gone, erased beneath a blanket of snow so deep and dense it seemed to have swallowed all sound. He pulled on his insulated overalls and heavy boots, his breath pluming in the frigid air of the kitchen. The power was out. The silence was absolute. He made coffee on the old propane stove, the hiss of the burner a welcome intrusion. Looking out the window, he saw no sign of life. No lights from the Bishop place, no smoke from their chimney. Dale's massive Steiger, which had been a beacon of defiance the night before, was now just another lump in the field, a green monument to a battle lost against the weather. Art's first thought was of his livestock. He had a small herd of Hereford cattle in the feedlot behind the barn. He spent the next 2 hours fighting his way through the drifts, his body aching with the cold and the effort. He shoveled a path to the barn, the dry, powdery snow squeaking under his scoop. Inside, the animals were restless but safe. He broke the thick ice in the water tank with a sledgehammer and threw down fresh bales of hay from the loft. The simple, honest work warmed him. By mid-morning, he turned his attention to his machinery. He knew what this kind of cold could do. He went to the machine shed, the door groaning in protest as he forced it open against a drift. The air inside was colder than a banker's heart. He looked at his Farmall 806. It was an old friend, but a cantankerous one in the cold. He'd had the foresight to plug in the block heater before the storm hit, running a heavy extension cord from the house. But with the power out, that was useless now. The engine block would be a solid chunk of frozen iron. He checked the fuel tank. He always switched to #1 diesel in November, a lighter, more refined fuel that was less likely to turn to a thick wax, or gel, in the cold. He knew Dale, always buying in bulk to get the best price, filled his 1,000-gallon tank with the cheaper #2 diesel in the fall. In this cold, the fuel in that Steiger's lines would have the consistency of petroleum jelly. The injectors wouldn't be able to atomize it. It wouldn't start until May without a heated shop and a lot of luck. Art grabbed the can of ether from the shelf. Starting fluid was the last resort for a stubborn diesel, a shot of pure volatility to force the first combustion. He climbed into the seat, the vinyl cracking under his weight. He turned the key. The starter groaned, a slow, painful sound as it fought against the thick, molasses-like 30-weight oil in the engine pan. The engine turned over once, twice. He gave it a small, cautious sniff of ether into the air intake, just a whisper. He knew too much could crack a piston head or bend a connecting rod. He turned the key again. The engine coughed, a single violent bark that shook the whole tractor. He gave it another sniff. This time it caught. Black smoke billowed from the exhaust stack, filling the shed with the acrid smell of unburnt fuel. The engine sputtered, caught again, and then settled into a rough, clattering idle, each cylinder firing like a hammer blow. To Art, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He let it warm up for a full half-hour before he backed it out, attaching the old 7-foot snowblower to the 3-point hitch. It was a slow, arduous process, but by late afternoon he had cleared a path from his house to the barn and then started the long, grinding work of opening up his half-mile lane to the county road. It was 3 days before the county plows came through. In that time, the world remained frozen and isolated. The radio, running on batteries, brought news of a statewide emergency. The governor had called out the National Guard. But out here, you were on your own. On the third day, Art saw movement at the Bishop place. It was Dale, on foot, struggling through the waist-deep drifts, a gas can in each hand. His face was gaunt, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a desperate exhaustion. Art met him at the end of the lane. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice neutral. Dale didn't look him in the eye. He stared at the cleared path Art's old tractor had carved. "Power's still out, generators out of gas. We're burning furniture to keep the house warm. The big tractors, they won't even turn over. Batteries are dead. Fuel's gelled up solid." He gestured vaguely toward his state-of-the-art machine shed. "Got a barn full of the most advanced farm equipment in the county, and I might as well have 100 tons of scrap iron." Art didn't say anything. He just went to his fuel tank, unlocked it, and filled Dale's 2 cans with gasoline for his generator. Then he went back to the 806, fired it up, and spent the rest of the day clearing Dale Bishop's lane. He never said a word about payment, and Dale never offered. The act hung in the frozen air between them, a debt that couldn't be measured in dollars. The blizzard had broken more than just the weather. It had broken the myth of the modern machine. It had revealed that in a real crisis, complexity was a weakness, and the simple, rugged tool in the hands of a man who knew how to use it was the only thing that mattered. The blizzard of '78 was the first crack in the dam, but the flood came in the summer of 1980. It didn't come with wind or snow, but with a letter from the Federal Land Bank. The news traveled through the community like a contagion. Interest rates, tied to the prime rate set by the Federal Reserve in a desperate attempt to curb runaway inflation, were being adjusted. Art read his newspaper at the kitchen table, the numbers leaping off the page. The prime rate had hit 20%. For Art, it was a headline. For Dale Bishop, it was a death sentence. Dale's entire empire was built on variable rate loans. The 8% operating note he'd used to buy seed and fertilizer that spring was suddenly 18%. The mortgage payments on the 1,000 acres he'd bought when land was $4,000 an acre, payments that were already crippling, effectively doubled overnight. At the same time, a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a political move made in a distant capital, sent the price of corn plummeting. The market bottomed out. Suddenly, Dale was paying twice as much to produce a crop that was worth half as much. The swagger was gone for good now. Art would see him at the co-op, his face pale and drawn, his eyes constantly darting around as if he were looking for an escape route. The confident pronouncements about leverage and cash flow were replaced by hushed, frantic phone calls to his banker. The new Chevy pickup was traded for a beat-up Ford, and the spending stopped. But the interest kept accumulating, a silent, relentless predator. The end came the following autumn, in the fall of '81. The notice was tacked to the bulletin board at the post office, a stark black-and-white sheet of paper that felt like a funeral notice. "Public auction," it read, "by order of the First National Bank of Grafton County, the real and personal property of Bishop Farms." The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect reflection of the community's mood. The entire county was there, it seemed. They weren't there to gloat or to pick over a neighbor's bones. They were there in a kind of horrified solidarity, knowing that the same fate could befall any of them. The farmstead was crowded with trucks and cars, parked haphazardly in the harvested fields. Dale's magnificent machines, the Steiger Panther, the 7720 Combine, the 4840 tractor, were all lined up in a neat funereal row, each with a number chalked on its side. They were clean, polished, and looked as powerful as ever, but they were tainted by failure. Art stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. He saw Dale standing near the house with his wife, both of them looking like ghosts at their own wake. Bill Abernathy, the banker who had once praised Dale as a visionary, stood with the auctioneers, his face a mask of professional detachment. The auctioneer's chant began, a rapid-fire cadence that sliced through the somber silence. The smaller items went first: tools, wagons, fuel tanks. The prices were pitiful. A sense of panic was in the air, credit was non-existent, and nobody had any cash. Men who a few years ago would have bid each other up for sport now stood with their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. Then came the big iron. The Steiger Panther, Dale's pride and joy, a machine that had cost him over $100,000 just 4 years earlier, was the first up. The bidding started low and stalled almost immediately. It sold for $30,000 to a large corporate farm from out of state. Art watched as Dale flinched, as if he'd been physically struck. One by one, the pieces of his dream were dismantled and sold for a fraction of their worth. Art wasn't there to buy. He was there to bear witness. He felt a deep, profound sorrow, not for the failure of one man, but for the failure of an idea. The idea that a farm was no different from any other business, that land was just another commodity, and that debt was a tool instead of a master. As the auction wound down, the auctioneer moved to the last major parcel, the original Bishop home quarter, the 160 acres that had been in Dale's family for 3 generations. It included the house, the barns, the history. Art saw the look of utter devastation on Dale's face. This was the final blow. Something moved in Art. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a sense of justice, but a different kind of justice than he would have expected. He saw the system that had built Dale up now tearing him down and casting him aside. He saw a man about to lose not just his business, but his very identity. Art quietly made his way to the front of the crowd as the bidding began. The bidding was sluggish. Land values had collapsed along with commodity prices. The auctioneer was struggling to get a decent opening bid. Art waited. He listened as a few speculators and another out-of-state investment group traded bids, pushing the price up slowly, methodically, dispassionately. When they paused, the auctioneer scanning the crowd for another offer, Art raised his hand. 100,000, he said, his voice clear and steady. A hush fell over the crowd. It was a fair price, but not a bargain. More importantly, it was cash. Everyone knew Art Madsen didn't deal in credit. The speculators looked at each other, shrugged, and shook their heads. The auctioneer called for another bid. Once, twice. The gavel fell. Sold to Arthur Madsen. A murmur went through the crowd. Art ignored it. He walked over to the clerk's table, wrote a check from the savings account he had so carefully built during the good years, and took the receipt. He didn't look at Dale. He just got in his old Lodestar and drove home, the weight of what he had just done settling upon him. He had survived, and in the end, that survival had given him a power he had never sought. The next morning, Art drove his truck down the lane and pulled into Dale Bishop's yard. Dale was loading the last of their personal belongings into a small U-Haul trailer. He looked up as Art approached, his face a mixture of shame and resentment. "Come to take possession?" Dale asked, his voice rough. "The bank said we have till the end of the week." "I'm not here for that," Art said quietly. He held out a piece of paper. "I stopped by the lawyer's office in town this morning. Had him draw this up." Dale took the paper hesitantly. He read it, his eyes scanning the legal language. He read it a second time, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "It's a 5-year lease," Art explained, "for the house, the barns, and the home quarter. The price is 1/3 of the crop, payable after harvest. That's the old way, the fair way. It's your family's land, Dale. It should be worked by a bishop." Dale looked up from the paper, his eyes glistening. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The man who had once mocked Art, who had called him a fool and a relic, stood there utterly broken and utterly beholden to him. "Why?" Dale finally managed to whisper. Art looked out over the fields, the same fields he had looked at his entire life. "Because my father taught me that the land doesn't belong to us," he said. "We just take care of it for a while. And because no man should have to watch his own history get hauled away on a flatbed truck. You farm it, you look after it, and maybe in 5 years you'll be in a position to buy it back. For what I paid for it, not a penny more." That single act of grace echoed through the county louder than any auctioneer's gavel. It redefined Arthur Madsen in the eyes of his neighbors. He was no longer the stubborn old-timer who was afraid of progress. He was the man who had weathered the storm, the man who understood the true meaning of wealth. He was the anchor in a sea of chaos. The 1980s were lean years for everyone, but Art's farm was a picture of stability. His expenses were a fraction of what they had been for the high-flying operators. When a bearing went out on his planter, he didn't call a dealer for a $1,000 service visit. He went to his shop, pressed out the old one, and found a replacement in a coffee can on the shelf. He grew his own seed corn. He rotated his crops with alfalfa and clover, letting the livestock and the legumes replenish the nitrogen in the soil, drastically cutting his fertilizer bill. He was practicing a form of agriculture that the university experts would, decades later, give a fancy name: sustainable. Art just called it farming. Dale Bishop took the lease. He sold the U-Haul and unpacked his boxes. He bought a small 20-year-old John Deere 4020 and a 6-row planter at a foreclosure sale. He farmed his 160 acres with a quiet intensity. The two men were neighbors now in a way they had never been before. There was no rivalry, only a shared understanding. Sometimes, on a summer evening, Dale would walk over to Art's shop, where Art would be tinkering with the old 806. They wouldn't talk much. Dale would just watch, learning the skills he had skipped over in his rush to get big. He learned how to time an injection pump, how to set the valves, how to read the language of a working engine. Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed. Art's grandson, a boy named Thomas, started spending his summers on the farm. He was a quiet boy with his grandfather's steady blue eyes. Art didn't teach him about leveraging equity or cash flow. He taught him how to listen to an engine, how to feel the soil to know when it was ready to plant, and how to weld a clean, strong bead. One Saturday afternoon, when Thomas was about 15, they were in the shop doing an oil change on the farmall. The tractor was nearly 40 years old now, its red paint almost completely faded to a soft orange patina, but the engine purred like it was new. "Grandpa," Thomas asked, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, "why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? You could have, especially after the crisis, when they were so cheap." Art stopped turning the wrench on the oil filter. He looked at the boy, then at the tractor. "This tractor," he said, patting the fuel tank, "has never lied to me. It's never sent me a bill I couldn't pay. Every part on it I can hold in my hand. I can understand it. When you own something, truly own it, you're free. The minute you owe the bank for it, it owns you. It tells you what to plant. It tells you when to sell. It decides whether you get to sleep at night." He pointed toward the Bishop place, where Dale's much newer but still modest tractor was kicking up dust in the distance. Dale was the best farmer in this county. He could make corn grow on a paved road. But he forgot the most important rule. You can't farm from a banker's office. You have to farm from right here. Art tapped his own chest, then pointed to the rich black soil outside the shop door. "From the heart and from the land. Everything else is just noise." 5 years to the day after the auction, Dale Bishop walked over with a cashier's check in his hand and bought his family's farm back. Art lived to be a very old man. He farmed until he was 80, finally handing the reins over to Thomas. He never borrowed a dime. He died in the same bed he was born in the old farmhouse his grandfather had built. On the day of his funeral, the church was overflowing. The procession to the cemetery was a mile long, made up not of shiny new pickups, but of the old, well-maintained tractors of the farmers who had survived, who had learned his lesson. Leading the procession, right behind the hearse, was Dale Bishop, driving his 4020. And long after he was gone, on quiet summer evenings, if you stood at the edge of the Madsen farm, you could still hear it. It was the sound of an old farmall diesel, chugging along steadily, pulling a plow through the rich Iowa earth. It was a simple sound, a sound of defiance, of resilience, of freedom. It was the sound of a man who had built an empire not of acres or of dollars, but of silence, patience, and the profound, enduring wisdom of the soil.